You. Well, good morning, everybody. Hello. Am I on okay, Josh? Is that good? Yep, we'll give it a go and see how we go. Lovely. Thank you. So my question this morning, phones, is when were you last really stressed? Take a minute and have a think about it. Define really. Okay, so I can give an example of when I was last really stressed, and it was actually this week. And so I had planned my week. We had some family stuff going on because it's the holidays. I've got kind of some work things that I knew that I was doing. And then near the beginning of the week, an unexpected large piece of work with a fixed deadline came into my orbit. And it was something that I couldn't put off, and it was something that I couldn't really give away to anybody else. And so I looked at my diary and I looked at this piece of work and I was like, oh, how am I going to do this? And so I don't know if you're like me, but you think, well, never mind, I'm sure we can work it out. So I'll try and do a bit of it here and a bit of it there. I'll try and shoehorn it in. I'll try and make it work. And the closer we got to the deadline, the more stressed I could feel myself becoming. I don't know how you feel when you're stressed, but I feel my heart starting to pump. I feel a level of anxiety inside. I actually need, maybe too much information, I need to go to the loo more often because that's just what it does to my tummy. And so I was feeling quite stressed. Don't know about you, but that's what I was feeling on that occasion. And so today, very timely, we are continuing our series on God at Work. It's from the book of the same name by a guy called Ken Costa. And our theme today is stress. Now, if you've missed it, if you've missed any of the kind of episodes so far, you can catch up online. But just as a kind of a baseline to tell you kind of where we're working from this morning, when we're talking about work, what we're saying is that work is something created by God. God worked in creation, and when we do the work that we're given, then we are being like him. And really interestingly, in Hebrew, the word avad, Simon told us a few weeks ago, is the same word that's used for both work and worship. So when we're working, that is us worshipping God. We're called to many roles and different forms of work. It might be that you work in the NHS or in education. Perhaps you're a mechanic. I wasn't manic. Perhaps you're a mechanic or an IT consultant. Perhaps you fit kitchens. Maybe you you maintain water filtration systems. Perhaps you care for children or for older relatives. And in fact, your work may be paid or it may be voluntary. But what we've seen through our series, that whatever we do, God sees it all. You know, this week I came in on Thursday. We have a prayer meeting on a Thursday morning. And I came in and we were meeting to pray just here in the front of the hall because it was a bit too hot to be in the prayer room upstairs. And I walked through the cafe, and the cafe was a hive of activity. And it was full of a bunch of people who are supposedly retired, but who were certainly working really hard. Because what they were doing is that a couple of weeks a month, we are donated food, and that food is packed up and sent out to people locally who need it. And so those folk who are not paid to do this job, who've officially given up different roles of responsibility in paid employment, come and work within the church family. And we're super grateful for all of those of you who do volunteer in different ways, both here in the building and out in the community. And a little heads up, next week we're talking a little bit more about how we work in a voluntary capacity and what that looks like around the city. But we've been encouraged to remember within our series that whoever we work for, whether we're in central or local government, whether you work for a head teacher or you're working for a particular boss, actually God is the one who we work for. If we say that we're followers of Jesus, we're working for him. And if we're followers of Jesus, we're not just followers of Jesus on Sundays, we're actually followers on Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And so over this series, we've also been looking at, well, what does it look like if we're saying that we're following Jesus? What does it look like to be followers of Jesus in our workplace? How can we be God in our workplace to those people who might never meet anybody else who knows him? What does it look like to be God with skin on? And also, how can we meet God in our workplaces too? So to give you my little CV, my first job, I had a Saturday job in a library, and it was really frustrating. My job was literally putting books back on shelves. I was never allowed near the stamp. But I'm very good at the alphabet and at numbers because I had to put it in alphabetical order and using the Dewey system. And then when I was at university, I had a couple of admin jobs. I worked for a medical journal. I worked for a sales company. I actually tried selling double glazing online. I didn't last very long at that job. I absolutely hated it. Sorry? I beg your pardon. Sorry, not online. I was on the phone. I'm so sorry. Over the phone. I'm too old to have done it online then. But I did it on the phone. And I remember I was only there a couple of weeks, and there was one time I rang up and we had a little spiel that we had to read. And it was kind of like, "Hello, I'm Joe. Are you interested in buying double glazing?" And the person on the other end said, "Yes, actually, I am." And I said, "Really?" Because I'd had so many people who would kind of put the phone down on me because they didn't want to be interrupted. So that was my one sale, and after that I retired early, let's just say, from that role. And then after that, I studied to be an environmental health officer, and I worked for Birmingham City Council looking at food hygiene and health and safety, industrial pollution and sustainability. And then other roles and jobs that I've had, I'm a mum. Nigel and I worked in a voluntary capacity as kids pastors, and then now I'm working with Nigel leading the church here. So that's kind of my CV. So if you've got any jobs going, you know what my skills are, and just come over this way. But so this week, as we look at stress at work, I think it's a really pertinent topic, because whether we are paid for the work that we do, or whether we're volunteers, many of us experience stress, don't we? I don't know if you've ever felt like this lady here. Everything just seems a bit too much. And in fact, in January this year, the TUC put out a survey which said that Britain is facing a work-related stress crisis with unprecedented levels of workplace stress. Apparently, there were 22 million working days lost to stress in 2024-25. 22 million working days. I tried to do the maths, and it's a lot of years. That is a lot of time when people haven't been able to work because of stress. And interestingly, stress is the same, doesn't matter where you live across the country, and it doesn't make a huge amount of difference what kind of workplace you work in. And so it will affect all of us, either personally or through somebody that we know, someone, our family or a friend or a neighbour. And so the NHS have given this definition of stress. They say, stress is the body's reaction to feeling threatened or under pressure. And when we're stressed, our body releases a hormone called adrenaline, which is often called the fight or flight hormone, which usually gives us a boost or motivates us to act quickly. So this is a normal bodily reaction, and a bit of stress can be really good because it can make us get things done. But too much stress, the definition goes on to say, can affect our mood, our body, and our relationships, especially when it feels out of control. It can make us feel anxious and irritable. It can affect our self-esteem, and experiencing long-term stress or severe stress can lead to feeling physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion, often known as burnout. And maybe you can relate to that. Maybe that's something that you personally have experienced, or something that you are experiencing. And so I'd just like to think for a moment, what does a busy or a stressful day in your current life stage look like? Why don't you have a think and then just turn to the next person next to you and tell you what it looks like or feels like for you. Or if that's a bit personal, why don't you say for someone you know? Okay, so do you want to bring your attention back to the front? And so for the people that I know, I mean, some of you are sitting there looking super chilled, and if you've got the secrets, then we'd love to come and chat to you afterwards. But for many of us, the things that people that I know would talk about when they talk about a stressful day Might be that the people you're working for want more and more for less and less money. It might be that you're in meeting after meeting or seeing client after client, or if you're a doctor, seeing patient after patient, with not actually quite enough time allocated for each interaction, so everything feels a bit pushed. Perhaps you feel like you're always watching the clock. You're eating lunch on the go if you've got time to have it at all. Then you've got to pick up the kids from wherever they are. You've got to get the laundry done. You've got to do your life admin. You collapse into bed only to get up the next day to do the same again. Maybe you're someone who's working in education and you're already seeing only 2 weeks until September starts again. Or perhaps you've been accustomed to that kind of Sunday night feeling. Anyone get that when you know that Monday morning is at the office? Yeah, thank you. Got some honest nods. Actually, you know that you've had a break over the weekend, but you're jumping back in tomorrow. And maybe you're someone who's actually juggling more than one job, just trying to make ends meet. All of these things are highly pressured and stressful. And so Ken Coster in his book says this about stress. Stress is the point at which others' expectations of us and our ability to deliver fail to match. So when the boss or your spouse or somebody else wants you to do this, but actually you think, I've only got the time and the energy and the capacity to do this. And that gap in between is what causes stress. You know, stress isn't a new phenomenon. Paul writes about it in 2 Corinthians 4. In his experience, this is it. He says, we're hard pressed on every side, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but not in despair. We're persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. Now, you might think, well, that was Paul. He was kind of doing his Paul thing over there. But actually, some of those emotions or experiences or feelings are very real for us, aren't they? We might feel hard-pressed and perplexed. We might feel persecuted and pushed and struck down. And yet the hope in this place is the other thing that Paul talks about, that we're not crushed, we're not in despair, we're not abandoned, and we're not destroyed. And so just looking at stress one more time. At the beginning, I told you how I experience it, often around my tummy, feeling stressed, feeling that sense of pressure. But some people feel it kind of in a psychological way. It might be that you feel distracted and you can't concentrate. I was talking to a friend the other day. She knew she had a huge workload, but it was so stressful, she couldn't even go there. And so the time was ticking and the work was piling up, and she couldn't even put her attention to it. Sometimes we're beset by fear. We're very anxious about what's going to happen. And sometimes we become aggressive to those who we're closest to. But the other thing that is really interesting about stress is, as well as being physical and psychological, actually it can also be spiritual. Because what it can do is it can make us focus inward and on us and the things that need to be done, and take our eyes off God. It can destroy our perspective. It can strangle our relationships, both with God and with other people, because we can't just lift our heads up and out of the situation. Thankfully, we don't end there, because a really good thing to know is that Jesus was no stranger to stress. And we're going to look at a day in the life of Jesus in Luke chapter 8. Now, this is quite a longish passage, so if you've got a Bible, you've got the Bible on your phone, pull it up. I didn't put all the words on the screen because it is a lot of words. But it's amazing to read a little bit of Jesus' diary in Luke chapter 8 and find out what he was up to. And some of the things he did, you'll be very familiar with. They're stories that you may well know, and others are things that you might not have heard before, and that's really okay. So we're in Luke chapter 8, and we're starting in verse 22. One day, Jesus said to his disciples, let's cross to the other side of the lake. So they got into a boat and started out. As they sailed across, Jesus settled down for a nap. So the suggestion is that Jesus actually was probably reasonably tired from whatever he was doing beforehand. So he's going into today feeling like he needs a nap. But soon a fierce storm came down on the lake. The boat was filling with water and they were in real danger. The disciples went and woke him up, shouting, Master, Master, we're going to drown. Anyone been woken up by someone shouting at them before? Isn't that hyper stressful? When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and the raging waves. Suddenly the storm stopped and all was calm. And then he asked them, "Where is your faith?" The disciples were terrified and amazed. "Who is this man?" they asked each other. "When he gives a command, even the wind and waves obey him." Wow, amazing episode. Wouldn't that just be enough for a day's work? The wind and the waves were calmed. And yet it goes on to say they arrived in the region of the Gerasenes across the lake from Galilee. So this has just happened on the way somewhere. Jesus was traveling and he'd had this stressful wake-up moment and he'd calmed the wind and the waves. As Jesus was climbing out of the boat, a man who was possessed by demons came out to meet him. For a long time he'd been homeless and naked, living in the tombs outside the town. Verse 28, as soon as he saw Jesus, he shrieked and fell down in front of him. Then he screamed, "Why are you interfering with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Please, I beg you, don't torture me." For Jesus had already commanded the evil spirit to come out of him. The spirit had often taken control of the man. Even when he was placed under guard and put in chains and shackles, he simply broke them and rushed out into the wilderness, completely under the demon's power. So there's Jesus. He'd been asleep. He got woken up in a hurry. He gets across in the boat. He steps out of the boat. This naked homeless man goes, "Jesus!" shouting and screaming at him. My goodness, my stress levels are high. I don't know about yours. They probably are now, me shouting at you. But this is what's happening to Jesus. We think our days are busy and stressful. Goodness me. Jesus in verse 30 says to the man, "What is your name?" "Legion," he replied, for he was filled with many demons. The demons kept begging Jesus not to send them into the bottomless pit. There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding on the hillside nearby, and the demons begged him to let them enter the pigs. So Jesus gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the pigs, and the entire herd plunged down the steep hillside into the lake and drowned. Now you might say, thank goodness, what a good way to get rid of demons. But if you were a herdsman, that was not good. That's your business that has just gone and jumped in the lake. And so just imagine people's response to Jesus. It's not going to be welcoming, is it? Verse 34, when the herdsmen saw it, they fled to the nearby town and the surrounding countryside, spreading the news as they ran. They told everyone what's going on. Have you seen what this bloke's done? He's just destroyed my business. People rushed out to see what has happened. We would, wouldn't we? A crowd soon gathered around Jesus, and they saw the man who had been freed from the demons. He was sitting at Jesus' feet, fully clothed and perfectly sane, and they were all afraid, as you can imagine. This bloke who's been tormenting people, who's been running around, who's been breaking off his chains, he's so strong, who's been naked and shouting and shrieking, is sitting there absolutely fine in front of Jesus. What power is this? Then those who had seen what had happened told the others how the demon-possessed man had been healed. And all the people in the region of the Gerasenes begged Jesus to go away and leave them alone, for a great wave of fear swept over them. So Jesus, having performed these miracles, having done these amazing things, doesn't even get welcomed into community. But on this busy day, when he's been woken up, when he's been shouted at, when he's been confronted, he actually effectively gets rejected and sent away. So he goes and gets back in the boat. He crosses back to the other side of the lake, and the man who'd been freed from the demons begged to go with him, but Jesus said no. So in verse 40, on the other side of the lake, they don't actually know quite what's happened yet, so they welcome Jesus because they've been waiting for him. And then a man named Jairus, a leader of the local synagogue, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come home with him. His only daughter, who was about 12 years old, was dying. As Jesus went with him, he was surrounded by the crowds. And you may know this story that there was a lady there who'd had severe bleeding for 12 years and nothing she could do or try would stop that. And she reached out and touched Jesus, and he felt power leave his body. And so Jesus, having been through this crazy day already, is then pressed in and hemmed in by crowds and pressurized and had demands placed upon him. And then in verse 51, he ends up and he comes to Jairus' house and sees Jairus' daughter. And there are people who are lamenting and people who are mourning and shouting and crying. And they mock him because he says, look, she's not dead, she's just asleep. And actually he raises her from the dead. Now, the suggestion is that this may well have happened in a day in Jesus' life. Wow. I mean, even if it happened over a couple of days, that's a pretty busy week, isn't it? There's a whole load of emotions and experiences that Jesus, who was a man, would have felt. I think we can read these things and go, well, he was man, but he was also God, so he can cope with all of that. But actually, he was a man who knows what it is to feel rejected and to feel got at and to feel anxious and to have a nervous system in the same way that we do and we have. And so the question around this really is, so how did Jesus cope with the stress that he experienced in his work? His work is very different to ours. But there are some things that we can see from his life, that some of them which Ken Costa pulls out in his books and a couple that I've kind of added in to show that how he coped with stress. And I wonder if any of these would be helpful tools for you, and they are certainly for me, as we look at stress in the places that we work and we serve. And so on the slide, there are 8 of them, and it's not going to take long, but we're going to buzz through each of them. So what did Jesus do? How did he cope with stress, and how can we cope with it? And there are 8 different things. Stay healthy, know your identity, know your priorities, fight fear, take control of your thoughts, take an emotional break, take joy seriously, and pray and read the Bible. You'd expect me to say that, wouldn't you, in church? But it's really important. So have a look at that list. Are there any of those that you already use as tools? Any of those that are already helpful to you when you are facing stress yourself? Just have a look at the list. And then as we talk through them, perhaps there might be something that kind of shimmers a little bit, that makes you think, oh, I've not tried that, but I wonder if I could try that. So number 1, Ken's book and the NHS website says if you're feeling stressed, stay healthy. Sensible to look after your body, sensible to take breaks. Now, Jesus didn't have a gym to go to, but interestingly, he walked or took boats between his different meetings and appointments. And I don't know what your work is like, but sometimes I go from one meeting to another without much of a pause. And so it can be really important, in order to stay healthy, to take breaks. You know, if you're someone who sits in front of a screen, you know the good advice, don't you? That don't just keep gazing at the screen. Have moments when you can really look into the distance. What does it mean to care for ourselves and our bodies by eating well and by staying healthy? The second thing is know your identity. Now, you know, Jesus, before he started any of his work, before he did any of the healing and the delivering and the teaching and any of that stuff, we read in Matthew 3 that he was baptized. And as he went down in the water, this is something that Nigel talked about, we're going to do in a couple of weeks' time. As he went down in the water and then he came up again, heaven opened and there was a voice. Some people said it thundered. But the voice said, "This is my son whom I love, and with him I am well pleased." Not just pleased, I'm well pleased with this one. He knew who he was. Jesus didn't have to work to get identity. He wasn't trying to achieve. He wasn't trying to please that nagging voice in his head or seek the approval of parents or teachers or people who've always told him he was never going to amount to anything. He actually knew who he was, and he could work from that place. And so an interesting question is, if you're getting stressed at work, what is it that's driving you? Are you feeling like you have to achieve? Are you feeling like you've got to get top marks, that you've got to reach that promotion? Maybe you came from a home where there wasn't enough financially, and so you're really keen to earn, to make sure that your kids or your grandkids don't experience the deprivation that maybe you did. Maybe you're afraid of losing your job to AI. You're worried about becoming redundant. And so you feel you've always just got to put in that extra bit more. All of these are big things that can drive us and make us experience stress. I'm not saying that working hard isn't a good thing, but we need to know what our core motivation is. And you know, we have a wonderful ministry here called Sozo, which helps us just sit with God and work out where things are maybe a little bit out of line in our hearts and our expectations. And so if you'd like to have someone just chat with you or pray with you about where your priorities and things are, that could be a lovely thing to do. You can find out more on our website. And so that leads us beautifully into, as well as knowing our identity, knowing our priorities. Now, it might sound funny that Jesus knew his priorities because he came to seek and save the lost. That's what the Bible said. Saviour of the world is a pretty big job, isn't it? But there were other people who had other expectations on him that he didn't fulfill. They thought and expected he was going to overthrow the Romans. You know, when he went into the wilderness, the beginning of his ministry, the enemy had all kinds of ways that he thought that Jesus should act. But Jesus knew the way that he was supposed to be living and what he was supposed to be doing. And so for us, it can be super helpful to know what our priorities are, what they are long term, and what they are for today. You know, I had a really responsible job in the council. I led a team of people. And when we had kids, what was really particularly important to me was that I was able to be at home to look after children. And so Nigel and I did a kind of job sharing thing for quite a while in which he was at home sometimes and I was. And bit by bit, I gradually reduced my hours working for the council until it came to the day when I knew that actually for me, I needed to give up that job because my priorities was to be at home with the children and to do some volunteering stuff. And when I went to tell my boss, he was really gutted. He was really disappointed with me. He said, I can't believe you're doing that. I thought you were going to come back after you'd had children, and I wanted you to get into this job because that was going to help what he was doing. And we worked really well together. And so that was a real blow. It was a blow for me, and it was a blow for him because I liked working with him. But I wasn't there to achieve his targets, to meet his goals. I knew what my priorities were. And you know, something we found super helpful was always, particularly when the kids are small, but even now, to think the priorities are God, and then family, and then work. And that can be really hard sometimes when work pays your bills, but actually God and family come first, and then work. Something I found helpful to think about is that when we say yes to something, we're actually, maybe without realizing it, saying no to something else. And so if we're choosing to go this way, to take this role, to take this responsibility, there will be other things that we just don't have the time to do. And so what is it that God has said that our priorities, your priorities are in this season? Now let's keep moving through. The fourth thing to do is to fight fear. When stress comes upon us, when we're in those moments of huge pressure, it can be really common to feel very anxious. And actually we can do something about that. We've got tools so that we can battle fear. You know, in Mark 14, Jesus said this. He knew he was going to die. He was going to Gethsemane, and he said, "My soul is crushed with grief to the point of death." And the Bible tells us he actually sweated blood. There was so much stress and pressure. He knew what was coming. And yet he chose to go to God. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of us have similar stress level experiences to Jesus, but it really helps me to know that he understands what it is to feel afraid of what's coming. You know, I was involved in a high stakes project over a number of months, and we had weekly meetings that were often quite unpredictable. And I found that as I drove to those meetings, the stress level in my chest would rise, and I would feel really overwhelmed. And I found that I was trying to prepare things in my head and think through every eventuality and work out what the answer was and try and solve the problems. But it wasn't helping me. I was just getting more and more afraid. And a friend of mine said, "Look, I think you probably just need to worship and pray." And so I decided that when I got in the car, I would set a timer, and whatever I felt like, the first half of the journey, I would play worship music and sing it, even if I didn't feel like it. And then when the timer went off, the second half of the journey, I would just pray. And I'd pray for the day, and I would pray in tongues, because that was the thing that got me through. And often I would get to the workplace where I knew the meeting was happening, and I wouldn't just be, "Oh, everything's wonderful now." But I felt like I'd put myself in a place where I was in front of God and ready for him to do what he wanted to do. And amazingly, he did. And it wasn't that anything resolved straight away, but these meetings, this project, was able to come to a really good conclusion in the end. So the next thing after staying healthy, knowing our identity, knowing our priorities, fighting fear, is take control of your thoughts. You know, Jesus understood reality. He wasn't knocked off course when he was opposed, when difficult days came, when people persecuted or criticised him. And as Duncan said last week, you know, suffering and difficult times will come. If we've chosen to follow Jesus, that's what we've signed up for. And so we don't just expect we're going to kind of dance through the fields with the fairies. Difficult days will come. But in those moments, it's really important that we are mindful about what we're thinking about. Because if we choose to dwell on the frightening, the anxious, the bad things, then soon our thoughts can spiral. And in fact, Ken Costa in his book writes this: in my experience, in times of high anxiety, the prevailing wind is negativity, and thoughts can easily spiral downwards. A persistent questioning can arise from the depths of the inner self relating to fear of the future, what others think of us, whether there's any significance in what we're doing. Anybody else get that? Why am I here? What's the point of this? Am I actually making any difference? What on earth will they think if I do that? Or is it just me? Me and a couple of others. And then Ken really helpfully says this: when this happens, the first thing I try and do, is reject the thoughts that are without any substance. So there may be truth in some of them, and you have to address the truth. You know, if you haven't worked hard enough for the project and it's going to be dodgy because of that, well, you need to get on and do the work. But if it's things that don't have a grounding, you know, what will they think of me? Well, they might not like you, but Jesus does love you. We've got that identity piece set in place. And so I remind myself of the truths, I dwell on those things. The mind is a gateway which we can control. With God's help, we can choose to open it to good and to close it to fear, uncertainty, and self-righteousness. So we're almost there now. A couple more things. Take an emotional break. No one functions well when you're constantly in a stressful situation. And it can be super helpful to connect with other people outside your situation. You know, I remember when I was a mum of little ones having a particularly challenging day. I had 3 kids, all probably about under 7. It was in the holidays, Nigel was away, and we had done everything I could think of, and they were in their pyjamas by 4 o'clock. And bedtime wasn't until 7:30. I was just like, I don't know what to do now. You know, it was pouring with rain outside. I was completely stuck. So I just rang my mum. I was like, Mum, what do I do? Had a chat. It was helpful to get some perspective from somebody who was outside. And so that's where networks of friends who are in the same life stage as you, or people in your life group, people who have a common and different common interest to you, can be super helpful, because it just gives you a little bit of extra perspective and a bit of a kind of, come on, you can do this thing. Jesus spent time with his friends, didn't he? Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. He went to see them. And he was known to have Peter and John and James. As well as his 12 friends, he has 3 buddies. And then that dear, dear one, John, the disciple who Jesus loved. Oh man, what a name. They must have spent some time together to be known with that kind of close friendship. This next one, after taking an emotional break, take joy seriously. 1 Thessalonians 5 says, be joyful always. That means always. Sometimes it's easy in times of stress just to get focused on the thing that we're doing. And one of the things that Nigel and I do is that on Instagram we sometimes save little reels and things, not just to send to each other, because otherwise you're kind of, you know, I'm here on my phone, he's over there on our phone, and we'll send things and we'll laugh. Did anyone have that experience with friends? What we do is that we save them and we can watch them together. So why don't you do that with some friends? There's a lovely little clip that I've just saved, really makes me giggle and takes my mind off things. So, Andy, is it possible for you or someone to play that one, please? This is just a bit of fun. So these are dads who are going to the ballet class with their daughters. How sweet it is to be loved by you. I close my eyes at night, wondering where would I be without you in my life. Everything I did just a bore. Everywhere I went, seems I've been there before. You're bright enough
you, baby. Oh, yes. How sweet it is to be loved by
Head in his hands, I love it.
It's just like sugar sometimes. How sweet it is to be loved by you. Whoa, yeah.
So God bless those dads. I mean, it's just a bit of silliness, isn't it? But for me, even that music, it just kind of lifts your spirits, doesn't it? So let's get serious about joy. If you find something funny, I don't know, maybe put it on the life group chat, send it to a friend, lift somebody's spirits. And then finally, of course, the last answer. Oh, sorry, gone whipped ahead. The last suggestion is that we pray and read the Bible. I wouldn't say this is just a suggestion. I'd say this is probably a requirement if we're trying to follow Jesus and cope with our stress. Jesus took time out to be with God. He often went off on his own, didn't he, to quiet places. And it's important that we all just find out what our routines are. Maybe you've got kids at home, you can't get up early in the morning and pray because your little one is up really early. Then find a window somewhere else. You know, when I was doing this job at the council, I used to sometimes have projects where I worked a lot of extra hours. And when that happened, I could save those up and then take a retreat day once every half term and just get away and do something different. So be creative about how to spend our time with God. You know, Jesus worshipped God with others as well as on his own. He was often found in the synagogue or in the temple. And it's easy to give up on meeting together in life group or on Sundays at church when we feel busy and we feel tired. But actually, wasn't it just beautiful this morning being led by the guys, Michael and the team here, to help our eyes fix back on Jesus, to remember who he is, to remember who we are in the light of that. So stress looks different for each of us in different seasons. And as we just go back to that last slide, at the beginning, I invited you to think of one thing that you already do to help you cope with stress. I wonder if you might just scan down this list and see if there's anything that you haven't tried yet, but that you might want to take as a tool to help you deal with stress in the weeks and months ahead.